Let's do it.
And just to get us started, we have 41 people so far. That's a great group of people so far. And if you wouldn't mind just to put in the chat, we can see your name in the chat already, but just the college that you represent and your role in working with DI, just so we can get to know each other a little bit. So the college that you're representing and your role with working with DI. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Gio.
Yeah, that's a good one, Mallory. Thanks for offering that prompt to folks. That's important too. The piece that I would add to, I mentioned this for those of you joining in the last maybe 2 minutes. I mentioned this to RP earlier, and that is that you may have questions as we go along here. I, of course, will do my very best to be, with Mallory's help, keep track of what we have in the chat, and of course respond to inquiries that people offer in the chat or just by simply unmuting themselves. But I also recognize that many of us in the session already have decent, at least foundational knowledge related to many of these concepts. So I see a lot of value to just giving a space for that exchange. So if you have a question, you pose it, and then you on the receiving end are also a participant in the session, but you can readily respond. By all means, take the liberty to offer some of that insight to that colleague, particularly in the event where a lot of questions are coming through and Mallory and I simply are not able to get to them all. So many thanks in advance for those of you that do take that initiative. Thank you. Okay, as Mallory I think alluded to earlier, we have a recent release to that report on disproportionate impact. Of course, there's a link here, and I think Mallory, you may have already offered the link in the chat. If not, it's forthcoming shortly. And our session really is geared towards just reaffirming a lot of the content from that report, but also expanding upon that conversation. So our conversation today certainly focused on the underlying method or methods tied to disproportionate impact, but it doesn't stop there. I think, and I see a lot of value, I think many would agree, to taking that conversation further, extending that into showcasing how these approaches can be used for action, how these approaches can be used to bring about equitable changes that benefit our students across the state. I'm gonna keep going here. Here you have a snapshot of our agenda, more or less in line with what I just shared moments earlier. We will spend that time in a few moments really delving into disproportionate impact methods, particularly to the percentage point gap -1 and the proportionality index. And I'll spend, the time permits to, Mallory's gonna keep me honest with the time permitting, a little bit on the DI calculator, which is, as many of you may know, or some of you may know, is a tool that helps to streamline a lot of those calculations. But I do want to, at that point, then pivot to talking about making data actionable, just for lack of a better term, how we turn information into actual equitable change at our corresponding colleges. And we hope to do that by giving you, I think, pretty good examples of what Mallory and I are doing at our respective colleges, but also, at least towards the end, giving you a space and an opportunity to communicate with one another, to share out some of the practices that I know you are already employing at your college to make this DI work as meaningful as possible, to use it, to really leverage it, to bring about real change at our colleges. This is, I think, a good starting point here, more theoretical, but I think it's pertinent to our discussion. And I would say a theory that many, maybe all of us really subscribe to, either consciously or just with the work that we do. And so what we're looking at, before I even go further, I do want to credit Center for Urban Education. Really, the work that was done by that group, in particular, Stella Bensimon, very much influenced just my own personal thinking of what equity means and how to leverage those ideas in a way that makes it concrete for folks and really brings about change at our colleges. So what you have here is theoretical data. These are not real data. These are fake or dummy data, as some might say. But I think this does a nice job of showing folks what we mean by equity and what the difference is between equity and success, because there is a difference. They're not exactly the same. So let's focus with, maybe let's start with the chart on the left here. What you see there on that vertical axis or that y-axis is that transfer rate, CSU, UC transfer rate, and I recognize there's different ways of measuring that. Let's sidestep that conversation and just focus on what we're seeing here. On the x-axis or that horizontal axis, of course, you have time, year 1 through year 5. Now, if you if I may ask you to focus in on that line in the chart itself that's traveling from left to right, from year 1 to year 5, it's sharply sloped there for you. That, of course, reflects the actual rate of transfers over time. And that line probably is consistent with what all of us want to achieve at our respective colleges. It's showing an increase. We want that transfer rate to increase, and to increase rapidly at that. I think all of us would agree that's what we want to accomplish. I want to now pivot your attention to those vertical bars that you see there in that chart. Those vertical bars that have those notches at the top and the bottom. Those, of course, if you're a savvy Excel user, you know those are simply standard error bars. But in this case, they're there in place to illustrate, in fact, with the upper notch, the specific student population that is doing really well, in fact, as well as could be, and in the bottom notch, the lower performing group, in fact, the lowest performing group. So at any point in time, when you look at this chart, the rates, of course, overall are denoted by the actual line, and they're increasing. Great. But at any given point in time, you see variation, right? You have groups at the top and groups at the bottom. So in fact, as you travel from left to right over time, while the success is increasing, that gap between higher performing students and lower performing students, in fact, remains constant. It doesn't change. So one might argue, I would say, rightly so, that what you're seeing here on the left is a wonderful success, but not really a change when it comes to equity. And that is in contrast, of course, of what we see on the right here, where that sloped line going from left to right is the same. It's in fact the very same line. The chart is otherwise the same between the two, of course. The difference is that here on the right, we have the gaps actually closing over time. I would say this is very consistent with maybe I would go as far as say what all of us want to achieve at our respective colleges. And so the obvious question at this point, of course, is how do we do this? That's a harder question to answer. And I don't know that I'm prepared to even give you a definitive answer. But what I will say is that one method of doing this, one key method of doing this, is by starting by looking at your data, exploring your data, looking for patterns, and of course, leveraging the information to bring about change. What do I mean by using your data? What do I mean by looking at your data? Well, disaggregate your data. Look at your data, not just from the standpoint of what the overall patterns are, but look at those findings by different demographic groups. Look at those findings by ethnicity, by age, by gender, by EOPS status, DSPS, and you name it. There are so many demographic variables that you could explore in disaggregating your data. And it's in doing that work that we come one step closer to achieving that equity that you saw denoted in that earlier chapter, or the earlier slide, I should say. And so what I want to do just briefly here, just more conceptually, offer you a visual of what it means to disaggregate your data, especially for those of you that may be new to the topic at hand. Of course, the first step is in identifying what outcome. What is it that you're looking at? Is it the transfer rate, as we saw in an earlier slide? Is it course success rate, as we'll talk about in a moment? Or a slew of other outcomes that many of us probably are quite familiar with. So the first step, of course, identifying what is the outcome that you're particularly interested in. One piece in doing that work that you'll invariably come across is the overall rates, the overall average. When you look at success rates, you can readily determine what the overall success rate is at the college. When you look at transfer rate, to go back to our earlier example, you can readily determine the overall transfer rate for an entire college or for an entire state, of course. The key step though, as I said earlier, is in looking at those data by those key demographic characteristics. In this case, in this example, by gender. It's when you start doing this work here on the right, when you start disaggregating your data in that fashion, that you can begin to explore potential gaps that may exist at your college. Gaps that, of course, with your help, and we'll get to that later, with your help, you can work at your college to address. Let's jump right into this. So in that earlier example, and just that preceding slide, the disaggregation there was by gender. In this case, we have the disaggregation shown to you by student ethnicity. What you're looking at here are data that reflect grades, the earning of grades. And so really all these numbers, just if I can start here on the left, you're just looking at grades data here. And more specifically, you're interested in the percentage of grades that are earned that are successful, that is, that are C or better, or that are pass or better. So for any given group you see denoted here, you're looking at that very first column, the total grade earned by that particular group, the cohort count, or sometimes referred to as the sample size. What's the total count of all the grades earned by that particular group? In the case of Black African American students, it's over 2,500. Next column. Out of the 2,500, how many of those grades are successful? C or better, pass or better. We see here 1388, to be more specific, is that number of successful grades. What's the percentage of that ratio? 54.5, right? So 54.5% of all the grades earned, i.e. cohort count, were in fact successful. That's our success rate. So up to this point, I'm sure you think, oh, this is great. I know it all. And I would say you're halfway there, arguably. But I would say here's where the fun part starts. Here's where the actual analytical work comes into play. Because of course, as you do this work that I've sort of walked you through, you of course will uncover success rates, course success rates here in this context, that vary from group to group. We have 54.5% for Black African American students, but of course, as you make your way down this table, you see that they're not all 54.5. There's a great deal of variability. Now, if you're coming at this from the standpoint of addressing gaps, of helping students achieve their potential, then of course you probably have an eye towards rates that are lower than expected. And that term expectation is a key word. We'll come back to that when we talk about margin of error more specifically. But what you're looking for are less than expected rates, and hone in your attention on those rates and determine whether in fact those lower than expected rates are consistent with a significant difference, or consistent, in other words, with what we refer to as disproportionate impact. So when you hear people say disproportionate impact was found for X group or Y group, what they're saying is the rates, for instance, for success for those groups are much lower than we would expect, and more specifically, lower than all of the other groups that individual or that specific subgroup is being compared to. So more specifically, what you do to determine that difference is you take the difference of the success rate for a given group, compare that to the success rate earned by all of the other groups. So what you're asking yourself really, to cut right to the chase, is what's the difference between 54.5 and the rate observed for all of the other groups, starting with American Indian all the way down to unknown? What's the answer? That's where PPG -1 comes in. PPG -1 is a reflection of that very difference, the difference between the rate observed for that group relative to the combined rate observed for all of the other groups. And what that means, of course, is that if you have a positive PPG -1 value, that means that the rate for that particular group, in this case, I'm focusing on American Indian, the rate for that group is higher by 1.3 percentage points than the rate for all of the other groups combined. Similarly, for Asian students here in this data file, their success rate is 7.7 percentage points higher than the rate for all of the other remaining groups. Well, you can obviously already see we certainly have positive values, but we also have negative values. And that's where that equity cap comes into play. So you're paying close attention to where we have values that, again, we were not expecting, in particular, negative values that we most certainly were not expecting. And then of course, you're thinking at this point, well, if I uncover a negative value of 0.1, 0.1, is that disproportionate impact? What about 0.5? What about 1.5? Where do I draw the line? How do I know? If I know that negative is not good, it means that that group is lower, but how do I know where to draw that line in terms of identifying that significant difference, that difference that we would otherwise identify as DI, or disproportionate impact? That's where the margin of error comes into play, or the MOE. And that's what we're going to spend probably the next 5 or so minutes specifically talking about. So when you identify your PPG minus 1 value, specifically negative PPG minus 1 values, of course, indicating that the rate for that group is lower than the combined rate for the remaining groups. What you're looking for specifically, if you have an eye towards identifying that significant difference, that is that instance of DI, you're looking to see whether that PPG minus 1 value is more negative than the threshold that's offered to you by the margin of error. The margin of error in this case for Black African American students is 1.9. So you're asking yourself, is my observed PPG minus 1 value 2.0, negative 2.0, or more negative than negative 2.0? If true, you have a significant difference. Now, there's a caveat to that, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But I think for now, that's the important principle. You're looking to compare PPG minus 1 to that MOE value. And if it exceeds it, of course, on a negative side, because you're mindful towards those students that are not performing as well as you would expect, you're looking for those values that exceed that MOE threshold. So I'll stop here for a second. I'm sure I've missed some questions. I apologize. I'll stop here in case someone has a question or maybe wants to offer some insight. Let me quickly peruse the.
I was just going to say, Gio, I think the main question is just redefining who that's the PPG minus 1, who's included and who's excluded.
Thank you, Mallory. Who's included? Let me go back to that. Thank you, Mallory. Who's included? So when you conduct a PPG minus 1, you're answering this question. What's the difference between 54.5 for Black African Americans? So of course, in this case, if your focus is on identifying that PPG minus 1 value for Black African Americans, that rate is included. So that's number one. That's the rate that you're principally focused on. Who's included in the other bucket? Who else is included? Who is the comparison group? Is another way to think about it. The comparison group would be everybody else, not including Black African American. Everybody else. So what is the combined rate for American Indian, Asian, Hispanic, multi-ethnic, Pacific Islander, white, and unknown students? How do you do that? I mean, I can show you. I'll just verbally say you can simply do that on the basis of the cohort and outcome counts that you already have available to you here. So you can compute, just like we've computed a success rate for just Black African Americans students, you can compute a success rate overall for just those remaining students. That's different, of course, than the overall rate shown to you on this table. The overall rate shown to you on this table includes Black African American, and that's the key subtlety that you want to be mindful of. So when you're computing that PPG minus 1, you're mindful of excluding the target group, the target subgroup from that remainder, from that comparison group. Thank you. I hope that helped.
Yeah, and then there's another question just to re-explain what the MOE
yes, excellent.
does.
That's what we're coming to. I'd say hold your thought, just hold on to that question, and in 5 minutes, pose it again if I haven't yet answered it by then.
I would like to know what the total count is for outcome. Instead of the percentage, it would help to see the total count so that we could, verify the math.
The total, I hope I understand. So the total
outcome
count.
Total, you see the second column, it says outcome count.
Oh, yes.
You have a percentage there. It would help to see the total.
That's a typo probably on my part. Yes, absolutely. It would help certainly. And if we had a little bit more time, I just grab my calculator and I do it. If someone in the audience wants to take a moment to grab their calculator, their mobile device, and compute it and put it in a chat, that would certainly be very helpful. Thank you in advance. Thank you for posing that question. It's a good question. Thank you for catching that. Let's go on to talk about MOE now. When you look at this visual here, you'll realize probably, before I even describe it, these are the same data we saw in that table. This is a visual way of displaying the same information we were just looking at in that table. So of course you have all the different groups denoted from that earlier table. The numbers that you see here, forget the color from, I'll come back to that. All the numbers you see here are the actual PPG minus 1 value. And of course, the x-axis or the horizontal axis is just, of course, denoting the PPG minus 1 values that we otherwise we're observing here. And of course, we observed in that earlier table. Now, what I want to draw your attention to a couple things. One, look at this horizontal bar that is attributed to each group. You notice how it varies in width. Some are more narrow, as is the case for Black African Americans, certainly relative to the group that follows American Indian students. What we're doing now to connect this to the earlier, and I still have more there, but at least initially to draw the connection between this and the earlier table and our discussion of PPG -1 relative to MOE, what we're looking for are values that exceed that range of values that are attributed to each group. So in fact, that line that you see going horizontally describes a range, a cutoff of values that we expect to see for each of these groups. Where does that value come from? We're going to come back to that in a moment. In short, I'll say it depends, not exclusively, but largely on the cohort counts. So please know the cohort counts, I'll come back to this in a moment, the cohort counts are driving, not exclusively, but largely driving how wide or how narrow each of those ranges are. So if we look at, and actually let's just do that just for illustration. If we look at the cohort counts for Black African American students, you can see it's north of 2,500. Compare that cohort count to the cohort count for American Indian students. Much, much smaller, 213. Let's go back to the visual. You can see then the pattern, and this is true of all the others if you make your way down that list. The larger the cohort count, the more narrow this range becomes. And of course, by extension, the smaller that cohort count, the larger that range is here. Who cares? What's the implication of that range, whether it's small or large? There's a clear implication as it relates to identifying an instance of that significant difference, an instance of disproportionate impact. Why? Because we on the basis of the range, we are saying this is where we expect the PPG -1 values to be. We expect the PPG -1 values for African American students to be between -1.9 and +1.9. So values that exceed that range are unexpected, are inherently surprising. Now, if the values, and I think a good example here is with Asian students, far exceed the expected range, but in this case, it's on a positive end. Again, if our emphasis is on closing equity gaps, we have particular sensitivity to the values on the left, that is negative values, and more specifically, negative values that exceed the corresponding range of expectation, i.e. margin of error. So the margin of error encapsulates a range of values that you expect to find for that particular group. So values that are more extreme, particularly on the negative side, are ones that we say, this is more extreme than we expect. As a result, we conclude there's a significant difference. There is an instance of disproportionate impact for that particular group. And of course, you see, I should have noted this earlier. The black dot says, you probably can infer just from what I've shared at this point, black dots refer to no DI being present, because of course, those are all positive values. And the red dot, of course, in contrast, refer to DI being present, specifically because those values exceed that threshold on the negative end of that range of the MOE. Let's continue. You can see it's very conceptual, this whole idea of margin error. Thankfully, we have tools that help to expedite the calculation, but I do think it's important to have a conceptual understanding of what is the logical basis for us making decisions about which groups we need to focus on. Here you have the equation for margin of error, and I'll just briefly describe what this all means. Believe me, it's a lot more simple than it looks here. The p hat value, let's start with everything here on the right. I'll come back to the 1.96 in a moment. The p hat value is simply the rate observed for that particular subgroup. So remember, let's go back for just a moment. The rates here in this column, these are all the p hat values. So the p hat value for African American students is 54.5. And of course, the MOE is calculated for each and every group. So you can see the MOE, because the MOE is calculated for each group, then we have a separate p hat value that we ascribe to each and every group. Let's go back. So the p-hat value, essentially the observed success rate. You technically convert that into a decimal, but that's getting into the granularity. Q-hat is simply 1 minus p-hat value. So if your p-hat value is 0.6, well, then that means your q-hat value is 0.4. Another way of thinking about this, when you take the sum of p-hat and q-hat, they sum to 100. Oh, they'll sum to 1. I guess is the other way to think about it. They sum to 1. So if you have a p-hat value of 0.5, and of course, that means your q-hat is 0.5 because 0.5 plus 0.5 is 1. So p-hat, the actual observed value for that particular group, the outcome rate for that particular group of interest. Let's talk about the N. And this arguably is the most important piece here in this puzzle. The N simply refers to that cohort count. Cohort count we saw earlier, north of 2,500 for Black African American students and 200 for American Indian. That's what goes here. Now, if you're mathematically inclined, or even if you're not, you can probably appreciate the importance of the N in this equation. That is, the higher the N, the higher that cohort count, the lower, I'm sure you can see, the lower the resulting MOE value. And if you don't trust me, plop in some values. We're going to work through a couple, but feel free to just theoretically just add some values and see what the MOE, what happens to the MOE as a result of controlling for P and Q, keeping those constant, and simply fluctuating the N. You'll see the MOE will change in magnitude directly on the basis of what that N value is. Let's pivot to that right now. Let's talk about that. So this, of course, underscores that point that I think I've been highlighting, and maybe at this point I sound like a broken record about, which is the higher that N, the higher that cohort count, the smaller the MOE. Let's go through an example here. Let's suppose the N, I'll briefly talk about the 1.96 and I'll come back to this. So 1.96, this of course isn't a stats class, and this really has its roots in statistical theory. All I'll say about the 1.96, the 1.96 comes from a statistical distribution that's been around probably since the 18th century, give or take. And it comes from a distribution where the most common value, and it's going to sound counterintuitive if you don't have the background statistics, where the most common value is actually 0. That's the most common value, 0. And values that deviate from 0 actually are more rare, and they become increasingly more rare, less common, as you shift away from 0. So value in this distribution of 0.1 is more rare than the value of 0. And of course, value of 0.2 is even more rare, 0.3 is even more rare. Values of 1.0 are quite rare. And values, of course, and I hope you can follow my logic, of 1.96 are very rare. In fact, if you're talking specifically just about positive values on this distribution, only 5% of all the possible values, 2.5% if you're talking about positive, 2.5% of all the values are greater than 1.96. So 1.96 holds a special place in the realm of statistics because in this context, it typifies an extreme outcome, an highly unlikely outcome. And I hope you can see or sense the connection to then the margin of error. Because what we're asking at its core with the margin of error is to what extent are we surprised by the finding relative to that margin of error? The margin of error is encapsulating of our expectation. Okay, let's go back where I was originally. So when employing this formula, and looking specifically at that N, if we have 1,000 as our N, you can see the corresponding MOE value of 3.1. Let's contrast that to the same p-hat and q-hat values, only changing the N. So only shifting the actual cohort count, not doing any other changes. Look at what happens at an MOE. It's more than 3 times higher. What does that mean in practice? Like, what's the implication? I hope you can see here. The implication is if you get a negative PPG minus 1 value of 4.1, here in this case, when you have 1,000 people in that cohort count, 1,000 grades to work with, you will say PPG minus 1 is indicating disproportionate impact. That's large. That's large enough for us to say that's a group that needs support. We of course hone in on that particular finding. That's a significant finding. But that exact same PPG minus 1 value, the very same value in the context on the right, you would say, no, there's no DI present. It's the same value. It's just as negative, but there's no disproportionate impact present as per this approach. So I hope you can appreciate here the implication of that N. The N has a dramatic effect on the likelihood of you finding a value that's consistent with DI. And this is in part because of the role of the N, particularly larger Ns, that the Chancellor's Office has established a threshold for those MOE values, or I guess I should say the PPG minus 1 value. So you might find in instances, I think I'll come back, let me go back to our table. Instances like you see here for Black African Americans, but particularly I would say for Hispanic, Latinx students, you see that MOE value is really low. That means just a PPG minus value of negative 0.6 over here for Hispanic students, they're disproportionately impacted. That's it. That's all you need. Just that slight negative. That's all you need to say there's a gap for this population. And you can see, of course, the logic there. Look at that cohort count. It's enormous relative to all the other groups. But that minimum threshold that I alluded to earlier from the Chancellor's Office, what that's helping to control for is instances where you do, in fact, have a large cohort count. And it's saying, well, if you have a negative 0.6 value, that's still not good enough, because we know that the PPG minus 1 approach is very sensitive to large values of N or large cohort counts. So the Chancellor's Office is asking us to look specifically at PP in that context where we have really low, really small MOE values. We're looking at PPG minus 1 values that still at minimum are -2 or greater, of course. So in instances where you have large Ns or large cohort counts, and as a result, really small MOEs, you want to have an eye specifically towards those MOEs that are below that 2 threshold, and make sure, of course, that the PPG minus 1 value that you are identifying at minimum is at -2. Okay, I'll take another breather here. How we doing on time? Okay. A little worse off than I would hope, but I think we're okay.
And I
Mallory
think you're doing it well. No questions in the chat.
Okay. Oh, beautiful. I love it. Thank you, Mallory. So briefly, maybe a lot less time here talking about proportionality index, but it's another approach that I think is very important for us to be very mindful of. This is the intent here is to do the same thing. Identify groups that are in need of more support. Identify disproportionately impacted student populations. The intent is the same, but the approach to the proportionality index is different. Let me highlight this. If you look with me at this table, look specifically at the counts. Look at the 2 counts you see here, 25, 47, 1388. You probably recall those are the exact same values from the earlier table. They are. In fact, all these counts identical across the 2 tables. It's the same data. It's the exact same data. But now let's get into the difference. So the counts for the cohort and the outcomes are the same. What's all this about percents? Why do we have a separate percent here and another percent over here? The question that we ascribe to the proportionality index is different, is inherently different than the question that we ask with respect to the PPG minus 1 approach. What we're doing here in the context of the proportionality index is asking ourselves this: is the representation of that group across a broader population, let's say the entire student body, is the representation of that group within the entire population similar or identical to the representation of that same group in the subpopulation of interest? And you're thinking, cut all the jargon. What are we talking about here? You notice those percents that you see here on the left reflect the representation of Black African American students among just all the grades, all across the board, all the grades earned by all the students. When you look at all the grades earned by all the students, 3.6% are grades that were generated by Black African American students. When we look in contrast to all the successful grades, that's a subpopulation, just the successful grades, we see those successful grades, we attribute only 3.02% of those grades to Black and African American students. What we're asking ourselves is, to what extent is that rate the same? That rate should be the same. Think about it for a moment. Shouldn't that rate be the same? Why would there be any difference? If just think about it, maybe another way to think about it is if you look at the service area, if you look at the cities that you serve for your college, and you find that in looking at that census data, those census data, 8% of people that live in your service area are African American, then 8% of your students should be African American, right? There should be a match, and that's a similar question. In fact, analogous question that's being asked here. When we look at our successful grades, is the representation of African American students identical to the representation of that group overall across all the grades earned? And the PI, or the proportionality index, is simply a ratio of those two values. More specifically, 3.02 divided by 3.67. And similarly, 0.31 divided by 0.31. You see there's a slight difference there, is because there's a difference when you go to the third decimal place, if you're keeping track. So all you're doing to compute these PI values is just taking the one on the right, the rate for the select group, that's the subpopulation, and dividing it by the rate here on the left. That's it. That's all you're doing. The question, of course, is what does this have to do with DI? What's our threshold? What value? What's our cutoff? The value that is endorsed by the Chancellor's Office, consistent with, if you're a researcher, you work with data extracts, the value looking for is 0.80 or lower. That is, if you uncover a PI value that's 0.80 or lower, then you can conclude confidently there's a DI, there's DI present for that particular group. That group is disproportionately impacted. Now, what you may, though, already have seen for yourself without me pointing it out to you, is in this table, we only have two groups that on the basis of that on the basis of this approach are even highlighted for you. Black African American students, and 2, Pacific Islander. Compare that to this table. We don't just have 2 groups highlighted here, we have 4 groups highlighted here. So you can, I hope, appreciate that the PI approach, at least with larger cohort counts, is less sensitive to identifying instances of DI than the PPG -1 approach. Obviously, there's more work that's needed to uncover instances where the extent to which they match or they mirror one another in terms of the conclusions. And I haven't been able to get to that work. If there's someone in the audience that's interested in doing that work, oh, hit me up. I'm happy to chat with you to think through an approach here. It would probably be something that involves a lot of resampling from a large set of data, but that's me going off on a tangent. The point that I really want to make is, again, you can see there's less sensitivity. And if you use that strict 0.8 threshold that I just mentioned to you, that the Chancellor's Office has endorsed, technically none of the groups would be disproportionately impacted. So think about that. These are the exact same data as earlier, but if we use that strict 0.8 mark, we would say there's no DI present here. And if we use the other approach, there's DI all over the place. 4 groups are in fact being disproportionately impacted. So it's something to bear in mind, and it's largely why I recommend the notion of using more than one method. Certainly prioritize PPG -1. After all, it is a standard for our state, but have an eye towards these other methods as well when you're doing that work. Excuse me, here you have a visual representation of that earlier table. Of course, you have the PI values shown per group. And what you see here is a more generous, a more liberal criterion that I have denoted for you here, because in part there's an argument to be made that while 0.8 might be our strict cutoff that we all work with, values between 0.81 and 0.85 may be still ones that we latch onto as still potentially being reflected of DI. What I've seen some colleges do, they take a 2-tiered approach, where if the value is between 0.8 and 0.81 and 0.85, they'll highlight it as just potential DI. And of course, anything that's 0.80 or lower, definitive DI. And that's something I think is worth exploring at your college if you are relying on the proportionality index. I think this is a good synopsis of what we just talked about here, with that ratio that reflects what the PI is all about within group comparison. This is just the idea that when you're looking at your data from the PI standpoint, you're not comparing between groups. You're not comparing, at least not directly, African American students to Hispanic students directly. What you're doing is comparing African-American students themselves in two separate populations. And you're asking, is that group well represented, equally represented across those two separate populations? You can see here that third bullet is exactly what we just talked about. PI seems to be less sensitive, particularly with larger cohort sizes or larger N values. And so I or absolutely, there's DI present, but you also have an eye towards those values. I'm sorry, I think my internet's a little choppy, forgive me. But also have an eye towards those values that are 0.81, 0.85. In fact, maybe consider if you've only been using PI up to that point, please, by all means, pivot to PPG -1 to help corroborate that information, or even use that third method that we talk about in that paper. I'm seeing the time, and I'm seeing that we're running out of time, in fact. So I'm only briefly going to say everything that we've talked about is otherwise coded already into a tool that I've worked on, and folks like Craig Hayward and other amazing, amazing people have helped to develop. There's a link there. I'm sure Mallory's already included it in the chat. Very, very helpful resource. If you'd like to get your hands dirty with these data, you want to start calculating these PPG -1 values, these PI values, etc. So I'll leave it there because I do want to make sure that we cover those two remaining items. The next thing here, just a few words here because I am mindful of the time. I would say this maybe reflects my own bias too. I really see, particularly if you work in research or you hold some sort of leadership role at your college related to data, say you're a data coach or you work in institutional effectiveness, if you serve in that role, your role really, from my standpoint, is not just a purveyor of information. You help people make decisions based upon that information. You help to turn data, say PPG -1 values, into action items. And that should be my opinion, your priority. So it's not just here are all the values, figure it out. Here are all the values, let's explore this. What are some recommendations that we as a group can come up with in beginning to address these instances that we are identifying? I have more to say there, but I want to keep going because I want to give certainly Mallory some time to talk about the great work that they're doing that all of us can learn from at De Anza College related to DI. Mallory?
Great. Thanks. And Gio, if you wouldn't mind looking at the chat for any additional questions.
I will. Thank you.
And the Excel calculator may be locked. I don't know if you need to unlock it, the DI calculator.
The DI calculator. Oh, I'll look into that. If it's locked, it's because it's locked to prevent you from making changes outside of the bounds that would allow you to calculate those values. So if you only make changes to the columns that are highlighted in yellow, you should be. That's not a problem. It's if you try to make changes to other things, that's where you won't be able to make those changes. And I consider that, and Craig and I certainly spend a lot of time thinking about that. What we want to do is prevent people from accidentally making adjustments to the formulas. And as a result, maybe possibly reporting incorrect information because adjustments were made to the formula as you were doing the work. So I'm happy. I'll work in the chat for someone that has specifically that issue as Mallory gets going with that presentation.
Perfect.
Thank you, Mallory.
And then I'm going to go through this really fast because I think there's a lot of questions. So I want to leave like 10 minutes at the end for questions. So we just wanted to show an example. So at De Anza College, which is my college, we have put together disproportionate impact reports. And there's 3 different reports. One, anyone can see DI at the course level. The second report is faculty can see DI in their own section. So they log in, they see all their courses that they've taught in DI across student groups. And then there's a third report where deans see DI at basically the instructor level for all the instructors within their division. Gio, if you would just advance for me. Absolutely. An example of what that looks like here is you can see that the yellow is just showing that there is a negative gap or a gap. The orange is showing that there's DI beyond the margin of error, which we just talked about. And so you can see, for example, this is De Anza College here, and that the groups that have DI for us are Black, Latinx, Native American, Pacific Islander. And we try to encourage faculty and departments to have discussions that prioritize these groups and trying to narrow the gaps for these groups. Sometimes looking at all of this information, because we also have special student populations in here that we identify as well, in addition to racial, ethnic groups and gender. So the next slide shows you that we allow them to just roll up the data and just focus, if you want to just advance one, Gio.
Sure.
Focus
Oops.
on just those groups that have DI. And then the comparison group is that same PPG -1 that Gio went over. So it's Blacks compared to all other groups, excluding Black students. And then you can see this percentage point gap here. And then we also added the additional successes needed to erase that percentage point gap. So if we as a college were successful in getting 680 additional Black students through the course, then we would close that gap. And then the next slide just shows you that we also add comparisons. So this on the left is the Intercultural Studies department, and it's being compared to the Intercultural Studies division. So you can always explore one level up to see where, you know, your section compared to all sections of that course can be a comparison. And then that course compared to the department to the division to the college, and the college to the district. So you can compare and see where there may or may not be DI present for certain groups. And so, for example, if you have unknown gender, there's a negative gap at the department level, but not at the division level. So there could be conversations from the department with others within their division of what they're doing to support students with an unknown gender, because they don't have a negative gap. And so just the purpose of this tool is really to have these conversations. And we're going to be starting to automatically send these reports to all faculty starting in the fall. So they no longer have to go into a tool to get their information. It's going to be right there for them in their inbox. So every section that they teach, they'll have this analysis of their own section compared to all of the courses taught that quarter, and then compared to the college overall, so they can see where they fall. So that leaves us with 10 minutes. Gio, do you want to give your example? Or you want to open it up for questions?
If I may, maybe just 2 minutes, just to give people some context. And if they have questions, you of course email me, and I'm happy to give you more insight into how we're using our college. And then we'll pivot to questions. So just briefly, just to I guess offer an example that speaks more to student support or student services, and some of you may have that background under your belt. This is something similar that we've done in our college. The difference is that rather than just looking at data just for the entire program, how many students are in EOPS, DSPS, you name it, the focus really in doing this work is calling attention to specific activities or works that are being done by our different units. So it's not just how many total students you serve, is identify all the work that you're doing, and let's look at the data. Let's track those data of students that are accessing those resources and those supports, and let's disaggregate those data with an eye towards identifying potential DI, and let's close those gaps. So I'll just briefly skip to this. This is in reference to great work that's being done by our college's transfer center. And so this is in reference to those that are attending or not attending workshops. And what you see here is that on the left, bars indicating the percentages of students that are in fact accessing those workshops, specifically for African American, Hispanic, and economically disadvantaged. And on the right, you have those rates for our campus as a whole. And so of course, what we're looking for is our gaps, right? And you see that gap denoted for you on the far right, or far left, excuse me, for African American students. That ratio of 2.9 and 4.3, as you probably have already identified, and that ratio would be indicative of a PI. And that PI value is probably in ballparking at 0.7 or thereabouts. And over here, in this next example, looking at students that are actually using a transfer center Canvas shell that's been set up for our students, that PI value probably drops to 0.6, maybe below that 0.6 mark, if I'm doing my math correct. I should have included the PI value here. So that I'll stop there. That gives you a little bit of a sense for the work that we're doing in student services. If you have questions, obviously don't, and I know I've just rushed through that, maybe did a disservice of the work, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to give you more insight into what we did. Mallory, do you want to pivot to questions? what do you want to do? What do you think's best here for the remaining?
Yeah, we can open it up to questions. You can take yourself off mute and we'll continue to answer questions in the chat.
Yes.
And then I'll also say too, I just linked to the DI tool that I shared. So if anyone has any tools that are easily linkable, we were going to have a breakout session, but we kind of ran out of time. So if you have any tools that you can share, just throw them in the chat and people can just grab them just to look at examples from other colleges.
Yes. And I saw one question I'll respond verbally to in terms of just issues with the calculator. You'll see multiple tabs embedded within the calculator. Some of those tabs are specifically designed just to give you an example. They're denoted with words like, or language like sample. So if you look at the tab at the bottom, you'll see some have the word sample and some do not. Those that do not are the actual calculators. So the samples will always be locked across the board. It's the ones that are empty. Those are the actual calculators that you could interact with by, of course, using or entering information into those yellow shaded columns. All right, so I'm sorry, I feel like I talk way too much. I apologize. I hope you still found that helpful. Oh, thank you, RP. Would you mind sharing a link?
I think they're internal to our college.
Oh, I see.
Of our
Sure.
research analysts here on the line. I don't know if you can verify, but yeah, I think you have to log in to access it, but I'll check. And if it's public, I'll share it in the chat.
Oh, please. And Mallory, if we have a list of all the attendees, we can then turn around and send it out.
Yeah, you for the RP one, you will need to have a LACCP account.
I'm sorry.
For the one RP mentioned, you will need to have an LACCP account.
Oh, okay, thank you. You answered the question, RP. Okay, thank you. So yeah, so that might be the limitation there. But if there's a screenshot or if there's a public facing version of it, that would be still very helpful for folks, I'm sure.
And then you got a shout out that from someone who's not from a data background, you're making them feel much less intimidated. So that's always nice. Good job, Gio.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And then I got a question about how faculty receive that kind of information on our campus. And I know that's a big question that always comes up. And I think it's just one of those things that IR needs to make sure that they have a good working relationship with faculty and often faculty leaders. So we've had faculty level data available for many, many years. And we, at first, you know, the union had been a little bit concerned, faculty were concerned it was going to be used for evaluation, but just continuing to ensure that they know it's not for evaluation, but for improvement and continuous improvement. And then now when we release something and we share it, we basically just get, can we have more? Can we add this? Instead of like, is this going to be used for evaluation? I never hear that question anymore. It's like they always want the next thing. So really developing that culture and sharing it out and then just ensuring that what you say that it's not going to be used for evaluation actually is the truth, right? You want to make sure that that culture is responsive to using data for conversations and improvement.
And I would offer that same exact response relative to work that we do in student services. It very much hinges on that culture. And if that culture at your college isn't quite there to do that work, that's okay. Then you can focus your efforts on shifting that cultural perception.
Mm-hmm. And then Gio, if you just advance one more slide, we have a couple more webinars coming up.
Yes, right.
Yeah,
Thank you.
All the way to the end. Thank you. Yeah, so we have 3 more webinars coming up that you'll keep an eye out on the RP listserv, just how you heard about this one. The next one is October 13th, where we're going to be looking at disaggregated data for students with disabilities by disability type. And then Gio's going to be doing another one, a deep dive on co-requisites, and then we'll have a qualitative look at co-requisites in January. So that'll be our fall webinar series. And just keep an eye out on the RP listserv or email either of us directly for more information. Awesome. Thanks, RP, for a YouTube video.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry we didn't have quite the time to do the breakout session. I see so much value in learning from one another.
This was so valuable. I just want to take a moment and say thank you. I love that it was like short and straight to the point and really clear and easy to follow. Thank you so much.
Thank you, RP. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Josue, for the one from LA. All right, lots of thanks. Thank you so much. We will be posting this recording and the slides on the RP group Multiple Measures Assessment Project website. So you can check back there hopefully by Monday. And I'll put that link back in where you can go back and check.